Good morning. My name is Tolu Bemishikbin, and I'll be facilitating this morning's Race Counts webinar.
Our primary goals for this webinar are for users to understand the rationale and approach behind race counts, become familiar with the tool and its major findings, be able to navigate the online platform, and identify the ways they can use this tool for research and advocacy campaigns. Here's a quick overview of what we'll be covering this morning. We'll start by briefly going over the background and rationale for the project. Then I'll explain the approach and methodology behind the online tool. Next, we'll discuss the project's overall findings, then take a moment to do a deep dive into one of the counties using Los Angeles as our case study. Afterwards, we'll walk through the live demonstration of the site, and near the end, we'll briefly discuss how organizations have and can use race counts in their advocacy work. Finally, we'll go over next steps for the project. Now, at this point, I'd like to ask that at the end of the webinar, all participants please consider completing the survey that we'll be sending out via email. So before we get started and talk about the project background and rationale, I want to pose a few guiding questions for this tutorial. First, what does equity look like? Next, why is equity important? And then the big one, how do we create or recreate our systems and public institutions to ensure that all Californians experience equitable access to resources and opportunity in the state? I want you to keep these questions in mind during this tutorial, and I hope that once we unpack some of the data and the key findings, you can come up with some suggestions of your own. Now, a question that a lot of people ask me when I'm out in the field doing these trainings in person is, what was the impetus for this project? Essentially, what led us to create a tool like this? Well, back in 2015, some folks at our organization realized that there simply weren't many tools out there for community advocates that provided a clear picture of what was going on in the state around racial inequity. Now, as an organization that's committed to lifting up the voices of communities of color in the policymaking and budgeting process, we felt it was necessary to partner with statewide community advocacy organizations like California Calls in Pico, California, as well as research organizations like USC Peer. In partnering with these organizations and over 100 others, we wanted to make sure that whatever framework we developed was both rigorous and community informed. As a result, we created a tool that blends advocacy, organizing, and research to support organizers in their local advocacy campaigns and statewide policy fights. We'll touch on some of those near the end of this tutorial. So before I explain the underlying methodology that informed race counts, I would like participants to take a moment to think about an instance where you've used data in your research or presented data in front of a non-technical audience. What were some of the challenges you faced accessing this data? Did you find this data simple or difficult to access? How about presenting it or explaining it to different audiences? How did you frame this data? Did you find that people were more receptive or less receptive to this data? What were some concerns you had, if any, working with racially disaggregated data? Now, in the process of developing a set of issues and indicators across a wide range of topics, two things were really important to us. We knew we not only had to scour the academic literature on these topics, we had to work hand in hand with communities. That's why we worked with over 80 community-based organizations to find out what issues folks on the ground cared about the most. We found out that both researchers and community residents were most concerned about issues like economic opportunity, housing, the healthy built environment, healthcare access, democracy, education, and crime and justice. We then further divided these issues into 6 to 8 sub-issues, such as housing quality and homeownership, park access, food access, employment and household income, poverty, incarceration, life expectancy, health insurance, high school graduation, access to early childhood education, census participation, and registered voters. We then compiled the data on these issues from all publicly available data sources, and we analyzed that data. Now, for folks who are already familiar with race counts and have been using the tool since it launched back in 2017, you'll be happy to learn that we've added a few new indicators to the site. Under economic opportunity, for example, we've now added food security. Under healthcare access, we've added access to mental health services, which we're calling Got Help. For education, we added chronic absenteeism, and under crime and justice, we added 2. For the youth population, we've switched from truancy and curfew arrests to arrests for status offenses. And instead of fatalities from police encounters, we've broadened that category to use of force by law enforcement, which not only includes fatalities, but incidents that involve the discharge of a firearm or that resulted in serious bodily injury. We compiled the data on these issues from all these publicly available data sources. We analyzed the data, and we then plotted the results on a scatter graph using what we call a 3-dimensional framework called performance, disparity, and impact. And so this is what we get. Each of these colored bubbles represents one of California's 58 counties. Using the vertical axis, we measure performance, which refers to how well a particular county is doing on any given issue or indicator. So let's take high school graduation, for example. The counties above the line all have performance levels that are higher than average. The higher the bubble, the higher its performance. Similarly, the bubbles below the axis represent those performing below average. So if we take an indicator like school suspensions, for example, the counties with the higher than average, essentially worse, suspension rates will fall below the axis and be considered poorly performing, while counties with low suspension rates, which is what we should be striving for, end up above the axis. Now that's performance. When we talk about disparity, which we're measuring along the horizontal axis, we're measuring how wide the gaps are in performance between racial groups. So what does that look like? That looks like counties to the right of the axis having wider disparities between races, while counties to the left of the axis have smaller gaps. In other words, smaller disparities between racial groups. Again, this is what we're striving for. So say we're looking at high school graduation, for example. The bubbles to the right of the axis represent the counties that have the bigger gaps in high school graduation rates between, say, maybe Asian and African American students, while the bubbles to the left represent counties whose difference in graduation rates between races is pretty low. Now, if we look at both performance and racial disparity at the same time, we'll find that the counties that appear in orange, for example, represent those that are high performing overall. Notice they're located above the axis, but they also have wider disparities between groups. That's why they're to the right. By the same token, the counties that appear in yellow are counties that are low performing, since they're situated below the axis, but they have smaller, meaning less, racial disparity or difference between groups. Now let's focus our attention on the last dimension of this 3D framework, impact. Here, we're looking to see how big of a population is being affected by a given issue. For example, the small county here is Inyo County. It has a population of about 18,000 people. Now compare that to Los Angeles County, which has a population of 10 million residents. The size of the bubbles illustrates the size of the population living in a given county. Now, if we move on to the next slide, we can see where a number of counties fall on this graph. Let me give folks a moment to take that in. Do you see your county somewhere on this map? And if so, where? Is it in the red, the orange, the green, or the yellow? So I'm sure you're wondering, what do the labels gains at risk, prosperity for the few, struggling to prosper, and stuck in unequal mean? Red, stuck in unequal. The counties in the red are the most critical. These are the counties that are not only worse than average on overall performance compared to the rest of the state, but you have some racial groups living within these counties that are doing even worse than the average. So what would policy solutions for counties that fall in this quadrant look like? Well, in these counties, policymakers would do best if they not only work to improve prosperity and overall outcomes in these counties, but if they also work to ensure that in their policy proposals, that the most marginalized and vulnerable communities aren't left behind. The counties in yellow are in a slightly different predicament. Similar to the red quadrant, these counties also fall below the axis, meaning they perform worse than average compared to the rest of the state. The bright side, however, is that these counties don't experience as much racial disparity. That means advocates and policymakers in these counties should focus their efforts on improving outcomes for everyone, using the same approach they've used to keep racial disparities low in their respective communities. The counties in the orange quadrant are unique in that when it comes to overall performance, these counties have outcomes relatively higher than the counties in the rest of the state. Unfortunately, overall prosperity and positive outcomes that many of these counties experience are not enjoyed by everyone. Within these counties, there are some groups that have poorer than average outcomes, leading to wider gaps between racial groups. The encouraging thing about these counties is that there are resources available for folks here. We just have to make sure that everyone has access and opportunity to these resources. The green, gains at risk. This last quadrant represents the counties that not only have high overall performance, but low levels of disparity. Now, while it might be fair to assume that these counties are the ones that the rest of the state should strive to emulate, these counties also have their challenges. In addition to this, it turns out that one of the reasons why we might not see high levels of disparities in these counties is because these counties aren't that racially diverse to begin with. In the end, this quadrant reminds us that there is no utopia and that policymakers and advocates must remain vigilant about equity, making sure that these counties continue to prosper economically and otherwise. So our hope is that over time, wins at the local and state levels can lead to improvements in overall performance and equity. The most ideal scenario would be to see all of these counties move into the upper left-hand corner of the graph, where all Californians can have a chance at opportunity. So I've added this slide here to let you guys know that at the beginning of this year, we added cities to race counts. Now, users can use our 3D framework to look at performance, disparity, and impact at the city level. It features 136 cities, all of which have a population of 65,000 people or more. Again, let me give folks an opportunity to see if their city is featured on this list. Our hope is that folks who do work at the more local level in these communities find this data useful. Okay, I know that was a lot of information. So at this point, I want to take a moment to answer some of your questions in case some participants weren't able to follow, or if you found any of the concepts unclear or difficult to grasp. In the meantime, I'll just go over a few commonly asked questions. So where do we get our data? That's a question that we get a lot. So we use all publicly available data. Our data sources include the U.S. Census Bureau, California Department of Corrections, California Department of Justice, California Department of Education, California Department of Public Health, Department of Finance, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, just to name a few. So I see a question here from a participant, and it says, how were the cities chosen? It's a great question. So one of the complexities that come with looking at data, especially population level data, is that you have to have enough numbers to be able to disaggregate the data, to be able to have lower rates of margins of error. So one of the reasons why we chose the 136 cities that we have on the list is because these are the cities that have a population of 65,000 people or more. So that's how we came to that list of 136. I have another question here that says Marin County. So this question acknowledges that Marin County is the most racially disparate county in the state. And I think the question here is there any way to include their largest city, San Rafael, into our list of cities? So this is related to the question that was asked previously, and that's around basically what is our cutoff for being able to include cities in our group here. And unfortunately, we're not able, at least at this point, we're not able to include cities that have less than 65,000 as the city population. Another question that we get often is, how did we come up with our list of indicators? To develop a comprehensive list of these measures, we talked to more than 80 partners across the state to identify the 7 issue areas and over 40 key indicators critical to California's future. One more question before we move on is a question around methodology. Another question that people often have is, how did we come up with our methodology? It's pretty complicated to explain in this space, and so I think the best bet is for you guys to go and read our methodology section, which you can find at www.ratecounts.org/data/methodology. Okay, before I get into the key takeaways from our analysis of racial disparity in California, I would like to just briefly go over some of the regional patterns that we've observed. Let's take the Bay Area, for example. Here, you'll notice that all of the counties in this region are above the horizontal axis, meaning that their outcomes are above average in terms of performance. However, as you can see from the counties to the right, the orange counties, the Bay Area has some of the biggest racial disparities relative to the rest of the state. Most of these disparities are around issues like education, housing, and health access. So the question I'd like to pose to participants is this: why do you suppose these counties are so high performing? What is it about the landscape or the economy that lends itself to these above average outcomes? So think about the demographics. How about the social and political landscape? How do each of these factors contribute to what we see here? And what might that look like for people on the ground? Now let's look at the Central Valley region. Here, we're seeing the opposite effect. Whereas the Bay Area counties are predominantly positioned above the axis, we see that the counties in the Central Valley are well below the axis. Again, what are the factors contributing to these outcomes? The economy, the physical landscape, the racial demographics, the social and political landscape? What might that look like or feel like on the ground for folks? Let's take Fresno County, for example. Fresno is the largest county in this region in terms of population. It ranks sixth most racially disparate overall in the state, though. The county's in the red on every single issue area except the built environment. So not only is everyone in the county struggling when it comes to the health, education, housing, and economic opportunity issues, there are folks in this county who have it even worse than the average resident in this county. The biggest disparity issues in this region are on democracy, education, and economic opportunity. Now, moving on to the SoCal region, we can see that compared to the other two, there's less of a clear pattern in terms of performance. Notice that about half of the counties in the region are above the axis and the other half below the axis. Now, as you might imagine, we have San Diego and Orange counties above the axis. I'm sure you can imagine why, with slightly better than average performance than Riverside and San Bernardino, who are below the axis and have well below average performance. When we look at LA County, however, folks might expect it to perform more like a San Diego or an Orange County and less like Riverside and San Bernardino counties. Later in this webinar, we'll dig deep into the reasons why, overall, looking at all 7 issue areas combined, Los Angeles performs 44th out of 58 counties. One hint I can give you right now is to look at the size of the county in terms of population. How might LA's population of 10 million people factor into this overall performance? Overall, one thing we're going to want to pay close attention to is how environmental and climate factors over the last several years may lead to migration, and how migration patterns, depending on how many people are impacted, might change the outcomes we're seeing in different regions. So after doing all this research and all this collaboration with community and research, the key takeaways we arrived at by applying this racial equity lens to the state of California were that, first, in every corner of the state and in every aspect of life, people of color and indigenous peoples still face the challenge of race-based disparities. The second thing we found was that injustice plays itself out differently in each region, and that different racial communities experience higher barriers in some issue areas relative to others. Now, if we talk about by race, we see that the Black community has the highest number of indicators where they have the worst rates and outcomes. These burdens cut across multiple issue areas from life expectancy, home ownership, school suspensions, household income, and incarceration. Latinos are the next most likely group to face the worst disparities across indicators, but they represent the largest number of Californians laboring under racial disparities. Now, while Asian and Asian Americans tend to score well on many indicators, there's quite a bit of heterogeneity within this group. In other words, the performance of certain Asian subgroups might inflate or obscure the performance of the entire group. In the near future, we hope to disaggregate that data on Asians and break the outcomes down by ethnic groups. So at the top of this webinar, I asked a few questions. What does equity look like? Why is it important? And how can we create or recreate our public systems and institutions to ensure equitable opportunities for all Californians? So here's a critical question that I think precedes these 3 questions. How did we wind up with the systems that produce these kinds of inequities in the first place? In our launch report, we have a section where we go into the major factors driving racial inequity in the state. They include antiquated public systems that reinforce racial biases or do little to keep it in check, exclusionary economic development, imbalance of political power, and overutilization of need-blind or colorblind policies. If you would like to learn more about these drivers of inequity in California, you can download our launch report at www.racecounts.org/issues/launch-report/. All right, before we get into the live demonstration of the site, let's take a moment to dig into a specific county, Los Angeles. So here's a quick look at the demographic breakdown of the county. I think this background information might be useful here. So of the approximately 10 million people living in LA County, almost half are Latino, about 30% are white, 14% are Asian, less than 10% is Black, and less than 0.5% is either Native American, Pacific Islander, or belonging to the other category. Here's a screen grab of the site with all 58 counties on the scatter plot, and LA County is highlighted by the big yellow bubble with the Black outline. If you look at the info in the box, it tells us we're looking at Los Angeles, which has an overall disparity ranking of 28 out of 58 counties, and an overall performance ranking of 44 out of 58 counties. Now let's break that down once again. Since the bubble representing LA County is below the axis, LA has a below average performance rate on all issue areas combined. When we look at racial disparity, which is measured by how far the bubble is to the left or the right, you can see that LA is right in the middle. So it's neither above nor below average in terms of racial disparity when compared to the rest of the counties in the state. So why does LA perform so poorly relative to the rest of the state? Well, right now we're looking at what we call a heat table of disparity. So what this feature allows us to do is to take a snapshot, or at least to be able to quickly eyeball all 7 key issue areas at once so that we can pinpoint on which issues a county struggles with the most. Here, we can see that on most issue areas, Los Angeles is in the yellow. But on 3 issue areas, crime and justice, healthy built environment, and housing, LA is in the red. Let's take a deeper dive into criminal justice and housing. Okay, so once again, overall, and on all issue areas combined, Los Angeles has a disparity ranking of 28. And again, that's when we're looking at all of the issues combined and all of the indicators combined. Now, when we zoom in, let's say criminal justice, we can see that LA goes from the 28th most racially disparate to the 12th most racially disparate. So you see how that bubble jumped to the right? Now, if we zoom in even more, we can see that LA goes from 28th overall to 12th most disparate in criminal justice and 2nd most disparate when we look at incarceration. Well, why is that? Looking at our bar chart here, it breaks down incarceration by race, and we can see that for every 1,000 Black residents in the county, nearly 21 Black people are incarcerated. That's compared to less than 2 out of every 1,000 white residents and 0.2% out of every Asian resident. If we do the math, we can see that Black residents in Los Angeles are 15 times more likely to be incarcerated than white residents and 100 times more likely to be incarcerated than Asian residents. So let's turn our attention to another pressing issue in LA County, which is housing. If we zoom in on housing and look specifically at housing quality, we can see that LA is again the 2nd most racially disparate in the state. Now, what do we mean by housing quality? Well, according to this bar graph, we can see that when we compare between racial groups, Latino residents are 2.5 times more likely than white residents to live in a structure that lacks a kitchen, plumbing, or heat. Again, ask yourself a few questions. What is it about the rental and/or housing markets in LA County and the economic conditions for people of color that might produce the types of disparities that we're seeing on this issue? Well, how about income after housing costs? When we look at the differences between homeowners, we see that on an annual basis, after paying for their mortgages, white homeowners have around $29,000 more left than their African American counterparts, and a little over $22,000 more left than their Latino counterparts. The racial disparity is similar between renters. White renters end up with about $25,000 more than Black renters and $15,000 more than Latino renters. These numbers illustrate that after people of color pay for housing costs, they have very little left for things like childcare, healthcare, food, and transportation costs, which is probably why we see people of color who often wind up in more substandard housing. Again, these are the structures that lack a kitchen, plumbing, and heat because it's likely that this is the best that they can afford. Last but not least, on home ownership, LA ranks second to worst to San Francisco, which I'm sure surprises absolutely no one. Okay, we have finally reached the live demo segment of this webinar. So if you guys can follow me, let's go on to www.racecounts.org in your browser. In here. Okay. I'm going to make sure that we have this up, yeah? All righty. So please type www.racecounts.org in your browser, and you should end up at this page here. Now, this is our home page, which is a dark blue screen featuring the phrase, California is at a turning point. And at the very top of the page in the navigation bar, flush to the right, you'll see the options rankings, state, counties, cities, and so forth. Choose rankings. This option will bring you to the page which features our county and city scatter plots. So here's our county scatter plot, and here's our city scatter plot. So one analogy that I like to use when I'm usually talking about the visualizations on the site is that what RaceCounts does is it kind of gives users a view of the entire state from about 30,000 feet in the air. Notice, here you can see all 58 California counties on one graph. So if we focus on this county scatter plot, you'll see that all 58 California counties are depicted in either the green, the yellow, the orange, or the red bubbles. Now you can hover over any given bubble to find out which county is where. So if you choose this county or this bubble, for example, you'll find out that it is Marin County if you hover over it. You can see the disparity ranking, the performance ranking, and the county population in the information box here. If you choose the Learn More feature, this will take you directly to that county's profile, where you can find out about the county overview, some key takeaways, the heat table, and the bar graph. If we go back to the scatter plot, so here's another way that you can learn more about a county. If you use the drop-down menu to your left, you can choose a county, and then you can go and see how that county lands on the scatter plot. So since we already looked at Los Angeles, let's take a look at the neighboring Ventura County. Let's scroll all the way down. Here we are, Ventura County. So if you look in the box, you'll notice that Ventura has a disparity ranking of 10 and a performance ranking of 18. You'll also notice that it's in the orange quadrant here. That means that relative to all the other counties, overall, Ventura County is high performing, but also high disparity. So let's do a few examples with Ventura. We know that Ventura ranks 18th in racial disparity overall. Now let's take a look at economic opportunity. If we choose economic opportunity here, we can see that Ventura moves from the orange quadrant into the green quadrant. So it basically goes from 18th overall in terms of racial disparity to 46th overall in terms of racial disparity, which means that it has low racial disparity, which means a smaller gap between races when it comes to economic opportunity. Now, let's say we want to hone in on a specific indicator within the economic opportunity issue area. Let's take employment, for example. Again, we'll see that Ventura County is in the green, showing that relative to the rest of the state, once again, the county has a smaller racial gap in employment than most of the other counties in the state. If we take another indicator, like median household income, for example, we see the reverse effect. Notice that Ventura County moves to the right, meaning higher racial disparity on this indicator. Let's learn more. Now, when you choose Let's Learn More, it'll take you directly to the bar graph for that specific indicator. Notice we are here in Ventura County, which is highlighted to your right. So if you look at this bar graph, you can see that the median household income for the entire county is a little over $77,000 a year. For Asian households, however, all you have to do is hover over the bar graph for Asian. You'll notice that the median household income is about $105,000 a year compared to the median household income for a Latino household, which is less than $59,000. So now what happens when we look at another issue? Go back to our scatter plot. Let's go back to Ventura County. Sticking with Ventura, let's say we want to look at an issue like the healthy built environment, for example. You'll see that Ventura County ranks 4th in the entire state in racial disparity on healthy built environment. So why might that be? So this is a time when you could take a moment to look at some of the sub-issue areas to see which one of the issue areas is driving up the disparity rankings on a particular issue. So let's look at the first sub-issue area here, which is drinking water contaminants. We see that Ventura goes to the green. So we know that the drinking water contaminants is not the issue that is driving Ventura's healthy built environment racial disparity up. So let's look at the next one, food access. Bingo. Here we can see that the issue food access is a major issue that's pushed Ventura County to the right when we look at healthy built environment. Let's learn more. Again, this takes you right to the bar graph that we're looking at. So we have Ventura County here, and we can see that overall, we have 3.5% of low-income households that live more than a mile away or 10 miles away in rural areas from food stores, food retailers, supermarkets, large grocery stores, supercenters, produce stores, and small grocery stores. Now, for Asian residents, that's only 1% of low-income families that don't have access to food. We look at white families, that's about 3% of low-income white families that don't have easy access to food. If we look at the Native American population in this county, however, we see that these families are more than 2 times likely than their white neighbors and more than 6 times likely than their Asian neighbors or 6 times less likely than their Asian neighbors to have access to food. Now, before I move on, I want to give folks a moment to take that in. So another way that we can look at how counties are performing on a given issue is to go directly to the county's profile using the top navigation bar. So instead of going through the rankings page, you can look at a county from here. Sticking with Ventura County. So here we get an overview of the county. Here we have this key that shows us that Ventura County ranks 10th racially disparate in the county or in the state. We get a county overview here that provides us the population breakdown by race. We can see where Ventura County is located geographically. Find out a couple of key takeaways here. And then we have our heat table here. Again, our heat table allows us to eyeball which issues a county struggles with the most. So looking at Ventura County here, we can see that on issues like education, health access, and economic opportunity, Ventura County is doing pretty well relative to the rest of the state. But when we look at issues like housing, the healthy built environment, and democracy, Ventura is doing pretty good in terms of performance, but we have large racial gaps in the county on those issues. Then, when we look at crime and justice, we see that Ventura County is in the red. So that means that Ventura County is not only doing poorly in terms of overall performance, but there also are large racial disparities on some of those issues. So I'm going to pause for a moment here and give folks 5 to 6 minutes to play with this a little. You can do the same process for cities, and I want you to pick a county that you're familiar with and then maybe a county that you're less familiar with. And play with this a little bit and see what you can find either in terms of the scatter plot on the rankings page, or you can go directly to the county by the county profiles where you can choose here from the drop-down. So, okay, I'm going to pause this for about 5 minutes. Okay, how was it? Did you find it difficult or pretty easy to navigate? So here's another feature that I want to highlight to you all. Now, in addition to looking at individual counties and comparing their profiles, you can also look at more than one county at a time. So here we can add, let's say, Los Angeles County. So this tool allows us to compare both counties at the same time. So we have Ventura County in the yellow, Los Angeles County in the orange. So Ventura County has a population of 47.5 white residents compared to LA County, which has 27.5 white residents. We have the map here showing the geographical relationship between the two counties. Scroll down a little bit and you can see the heat map for both of the counties here. Scroll down some more and you can see that on each issue, we can compare how each county is doing. You can see how both counties are doing in terms of overall averages, and then you can look at how each racial groups size up against each other in the different counties. So that's it for the demo portion. If anybody has any other questions, feel free to either send us a question in the chat or you can email us. We're always happy to answer your questions. Actually, I have one other goodie that I can show you guys in terms of features. So another feature we provide is an exportable tool. So that's essentially this. Any of the graphs you see on the site that has this little icon here with the 3 bars, that lets you know that you are able to download it either as a JPEG or a PDF, and it's printable that way, or you can add it to a PowerPoint or whatever, right? Same goes for scatterplot here. See, you see this icon here? That means you're able to download it. Alrighty, so let's go back to our presentation here. Here we go. So now that we're done with our live demo, let's talk about some campaign examples. So here's a question that I have for you. What's the point of all of this? Let's go back to our guiding questions. What does equity look like? Why is it important? And how can we create or recreate public systems to ensure equitable access to resources and opportunity for all Californians? This is what makes the tool so impactful. By allowing users to pinpoint the places and issues where the biggest resource and opportunity gaps exist, various stakeholders can interrogate the systems and institutions producing these very inequities and push for policy changes at the state, county, and local levels in a way that's informed by actual data. So this is where the advocacy comes in. Here, we have some examples of recent advocacy campaigns led by local coalitions of community organizing groups. The first one is the School Climate Bill of Rights. Here, Los Angeles Unified School District students and their allies won the right for students to go to school in a safe and healthy environment. This not only resulted in the implementation of restorative justice programs in schools in place of suspensions and expulsions, it also led to the elimination of suspensions due to willful defiance, which is an issue that disproportionately impacted Black and Brown students. Using school data on suspensions, youth advocates were able to persuade the Los Angeles Unified School District Board to adopt this change. Other advocacy campaigns include the SENI, or Student Equity Needs Index, and Proposition 47, which reclassified certain felonies as misdemeanors, allowing for the resentencing and release of several thousand justed impacted folks. Both of those campaigns involved the use of data on racial disparities between groups and advocacy for more equitable outcomes. The last example is Schools and Communities First, a significant campaign effort that can have a substantial impact on communities that have suffered from years of community disinvestment in schools and local services like parks, libraries, hospitals, and the like. By looking at the data on racial disparities in education, healthcare access to parks, and so forth, we can get community residents to close the loophole on taxing commercial properties across the state. In essence, race counts can help community organizations build alliances across a host of issues. Next steps. So first and foremost, I am available for in-person trainings for organizations that want to provide their staff an in-depth tutorial on how race counts works. Next, in the year 2020, we'll be publishing our Indigenous Peoples Report in conjunction with the California Native Vote Project. This is something that I and many people in the community are truly looking forward to. Also in 2020, we'll be updating race counts with more data, more features, and more geographies. We'll also be adding new indicators such as evictions, disconnected youth, and more. In short, we'll be providing more ways for you to use this tool to serve your organization's purpose. That's the end of our webinar. Thank you for taking time to join us today. Please make sure to visit the link that will be sent to your email today to complete the SurveyMonkey for this webinar. We appreciate the feedback.